Hi, my name is Ryan Languish, and this is Ludo Lodge, a channel about sparking growth in your journey as a game designer. And today we're going to be looking at how you might organize your game design projects, or specifically board game design projects, in the software Notion. Now, I did a previous kind of introductory video to Notion where I kind of went over some of the basic reasons why I think Notion is a good fit for game designers that might be wanting to organize information related to their designs or ideas or brainstorming. So that might be a good starting place. But if you didn't see that, I think you still could get a lot out of this video, at least in seeing kind of what Notion is capable of. Because today I'm going to be walking through a template that I have that I've kind of built up as a template that I feel covers a lot of what I would look for in kind of tracking my own game design projects in Notion. Now, this is by no means like the right way to do it, but I think you'll get a little bit of an idea of how I think through kind of organizing these things. And I also, over the last year or so, have become pretty familiar with Notion and kind of how to use a lot of its functionality to get the most out of it. So hopefully some of that'll be on display here in this template as well. I have no idea how long this video is going to be because I'm just going to kind of talk through as I walk through the entire template. But without further ado, let's get into it. Now, what you're seeing here is Notion, my Notion workspace. I have the sidebar over here hidden. And this is kind of like the homepage of the template that I'm sharing. And not only am I sharing it in this video, talking through it, but I'm actually sharing it in that you can copy it and use it for yourself or edit it to make it how you want it to be. And the way you're going to do that is you'll notice I have this share option up here. Then when I click it, share to web, I have that toggled on, which means that this template, this page in Notion is currently publicly available on the internet via this URL. So if I copy this and then hop over into a browser, it would look something like this, which is very similar. It's just kind of the Notion web view. However, you'll notice it's not an editable view, because unlike my workspace, you're not going to be able to go and change what it looks like at this spot here. However, there's this duplicate option up here, and if you click that, it'll have you log into your Notion account, and then it'll say a workspace that you want to duplicate into. And so if I select this, it'll just duplicate the entire template into your Notion workspace, and then you can edit it and do whatever, you use it as is or do whatever you want. So I will provide that link down in the description below. So if you want to follow along, copy this into Notion, or just grab it after you've watched the video and make changes to it, you should be able to get that there. So back here in Notion, I have kind of the home page, I guess you could call it, for this template, which kind of just has a welcome message and then a few links to kind of the main areas of this template. And I'm probably going to repeat this throughout, but everything you're seeing is just the way I built it out to be and is completely customizable. Like maybe something doesn't make sense to you or isn't applicable to you. You could just get rid of it, or you could add things or change things. Like, it's completely flexible. This is just hopefully a good example of what a template like this might look like. So I have my three kind of main pages here: projects, publishers, resources. And each of these are databases, and databases are one of the things that make Notion so powerful, is kind of the database functionality. I talked a little bit about that in my past intro video. Something I didn't talk much about, or any about, I think, is some of the power of being able to link databases. You can relate databases to other databases, and we'll see some of that here. But let's just start with what's going to be the most basic one here. I just added it in kind of because I thought it was maybe a good example, and that's this resources database. And this is just, I find at least, that there's times where I run across resources, whether they're, maybe I listened to a podcast that was really an interesting game design podcast, or a video that was a how-to. Maybe you watched one of my videos. I actually have here my prototyping and tabletop simulator playlist linked here as an example. And it's nice to be able to track and store those things. And so this would just provide a way that you could do that in a Notion database. And so you could add any new things here, say whether it's audio, video, written, or a tool, and link it or upload a file. This is very arbitrary. I mean, you could come in here and you could change these options to whatever you want, change the colors of them if you would like. And you can, however you would like. But I find it's kind of a cool way to store things. because some of the advantages is each of these are a page, and that's just true of Notion databases in general. So if I wanted to add any notes or anything to a specific resource, maybe I listened to a podcast and I wanted to actually take some notes on it, I could just put that in the page for that podcast that I linked. And you can also add views, which is one of the really powerful things with Notion databases. So there's some of these options like filtering and sorting. So for example, I could put a filter that maybe I'm going to filter on only where it's a video. So where type is video, and you'll notice that other one disappears. So that would show just my videos. And so what's cool is I could add a new view and like pick table, and I could make a new view that's called videos. And like that specifically, I kind of have it backwards here where my filter's on my all resources. But that allows you to kind of create these specific views that you can toggle between. So if I added that filter here, type is video. Oh, I misclicked. Type is video. Now I can switch between all resources and see everything, and I can switch between videos. I can also put a sort into any given view. Maybe I have some kind of way of flagging these items as like this is a podcast or a video that I already listened to, and maybe I rate them. Maybe I add in a field here that I could rate them, which could be a variety of things. I could rate it as a number. Kind of a cool way to do it might be to like do a select where, let's see if I can remember my shortcuts here. For emoji, maybe I like literally make the options stars. So like I have 1 star or I have 2 stars here. And so I could, have 1 through 5 and rate each one depending on what I want it to be. And then I could have it sort based on the order of those so that my highest rated ones are at the top. So just kind of by putting those resources into Notion, and specifically a Notion database, it allows you to do a lot of massaging of it or ordering it or views that maybe wouldn't be easy to do otherwise. And so that's kind of cool, I think. Delete this here for now. But that's the first part of this, is just if you wanted to track that kind of stuff, you have a spot here that you could do that. The other two I have here are projects and publishers, and this gets into kind of how databases can be linked together. And so something you might be interested in doing if you're working on board game design projects is kind of keeping track of publishers that you might think maybe are a good fit for some of the designs you're working on, or publishers that you want to specifically try to design for, or just want to keep track of some of these things. Maybe keep your own kind of personal publisher database with like what different publishers are interested in. So this is just an example of how you might do that. And I just have some example publishers here. But you could have like a tags field that says like these are the types of things that maybe they usually publish. And this is completely, whatever you would want it to be. But this field is where I'm talking about a relation to another database. So both of these relations are pointing at my projects database and allowing me to link projects to this. And so I could say like example project 1 is specifically a project that I think could be good to pitch to this particular publisher. And I can actually click this, and if I clicked into here, it would jump to the project 1 page. So relations are cool because you actually get that kind of like hyperlinking to move around in Notion. And these can have multiple things. I don't think I have some things that are ideas here. I populated out the template with just some kind of like dummy data, but only to a certain point because it was kind of, it's work to like make up a bunch of stuff to fill this out. But I have my example project here, and maybe eventually, ideally, you get some games published and you could link them here. So that's kind of something you could do to if you wanted to track publishers. And just like I mentioned with the resources, it's cool that each one of these is a page. So I could technically keep my own notes specific to this publisher. If there's anything that I just wanted to, any data that I'm wanting to keep track of that's associated with that publisher, this gives a very logical place to house that data. And that's really one of the biggest advantages to using Notion in general, I think, is it keeps the data with the specific publisher or the data with the category that it makes sense in. So for example, maybe publisher 1 I had a contract with. I signed a contract, I'm going to be working on a game, and I want to save that signed contract somewhere. Now maybe if you were doing that today, you would throw it in Google Drive, and it would be maybe in some kind of folder structure here. Well, if I was doing it here, I could go into my publisher page there, and I could actually just embed a file in this page. And that just is a very logical place for it. If I ever want to find things for specific publishers, it would be there. Or if it was for a specific game, I could maybe embed it where that game is. So it's got some cool functionality with how you can do it. And as a reminder, if you don't remember or didn't watch the first video, anytime we're in a page like this, it's as robust as the top level page in Notion. Like any page can have embedded in it any level of more pages or databases or anything you want. I mean, we could literally, put databases in this page if we wanted to and if it made sense. And then those databases would have, each row would be a page. So very flexible as far as how you can build out the structure of your Notion workspace. But that's kind of the publishers thing I've got here, which links to the projects. But let's jump to projects, which is really going to be kind of the main thing, right? Because this is designed to track projects. And so if I go here, we're going to see a database of projects where I don't have very many things because, like I said, I didn't populate it with a lot of dummy data. But I have some basic properties here that I felt maybe made sense to kind of define on a project basis. So for example, what status, is it an idea or is it in development, ready to pitch, some of these different things, to kind of track where each project is at. What's the kind of strategic weight of the game, minimum players, minimum length, maximum length. You can decide whether any of that is useful, but it was some of the things that came to mind for me. I also have some different views defined here. So you'll notice this is active projects, which is specifically filtering on a few things. It's saying where the status is not an idea, and it's not published, and it's not seeking publication, and it's not on hold. So it's just ruling out all of those specific ones, which is going to leave you with, I think, early design, in development, ready to pitch. So it kind of shows you the things that you're currently working on. And filters, this is just super powerful what you can do with filters in Notion. You can really get views that show you exactly the data you want to see. But I can have different views. You'll notice all the views I have here. I have one for all projects, which will include these ideas that I have here, which wouldn't normally show in my active projects. Because if you're anything like me, my actual database of this, my usage of this template, I have a lot of ideas. I probably have over 100 rows that are in the idea state. Because I just try, anytime I have, any kind of idea or inspiration about a game, I try to get it documented or get it captured. And Notion gives me a really clear way to do that. I can come in here and just add the idea with some, notes. I have this really good idea for a game. You can see I went all out on this dummy data. You could view specifically just your ideas. You could view, this is the pitching view, so it's specifically things that are in development or ready to pitch, and you can also customize which properties show in a given view. So this one, I'm more interested in seeing what are the potential publishers that I have assigned to that project. But those are all table views. You can view the same data in some of these other types of views. So for example, a Kanban board. So this actually shows each item under the status that it's currently in. And if we had a lot more data, that could be a nice way to look at things. And I could actually move projects between columns in this view by just dragging it. Lastly, here I have gallery, which gallery is kind of a fun one if you've actually put cover images within the projects, because as we'll see here, I did with one of them. It'll actually show that cover image. So if I had a picture from the game I was working on, this would actually be kind of a cool view because it would be just this gallery of all my different projects. And it's kind of cool. You can customize which properties show up. So I specifically said I wanted the status to show. I could get rid of that and you see it disappear. So you can kind of get it to look how you want it to look. And I mean, that's a big theme throughout. Notion is kind of customizing it to look how you want to look. And I think there's something you said besides the practical sides of that where things are organized better and it's easier to work with. There is something about giving yourself a workspace that's just very pleasing to work in. Like as you look in it, it just has a nice aesthetic that makes you want to spend time in it and work on your projects. It's one less barrier to working on the things that you want to work on. And I think Notion does a good job of, one, having a very clean aesthetic, but then also giving you the tools to make it look how you want to look. So those are kind of some different views here. But the main event of this whole video really is the project template. So something I don't think I talked about in my past video that's really, really powerful, I actually probably should have mentioned it, is that within databases, you can define templates. So, I mean, I can add a new row to this, right? And just be like, oh yeah, like this is a new idea, and I could fill it out. But what's way more powerful is to define a template so that when I add a new project, it starts pre-populated with the entire template of what I would want for a new project. So up here, if you go to this arrow next to new, it'll show you templates that you have. And so I have this new board game idea, new board game project. So the reason I have these two different ones is usually when I'm jotting down an idea, I just want to like get my thoughts down on paper real quick and make sure it's documented. So all this is really doing is it's giving it the light bulb emoji, it's setting it to idea, and then I could give it a name like new idea I had. I'd give it something more descriptive. And then down here, I'm just going to, type a paragraph that just gets my thoughts down on paper. That's kind of the most common use cases. I'm just trying to quickly get something into Notion. Now I could come back here and brainstorm this more, and I would have a full workspace for this idea that I could flush it out. However, my kind of workflow is that once I decide I'm going to actually kind of actively work on an idea, like an idea is going to move into the early design phase, I actually am going to convert it into a board game project. So anytime the content here is empty at the bottom, it'll actually show you templates that you could convert it to. So I would likely just maybe copy some of my notes and then convert it to new board game project and then take it from there. Now if we look at, so the new idea template's pretty basic. There's not like a whole lot going on there. So we can get rid of that. But the board game project template, if we go into that, and if you want to edit a template, you're going to want to go to these over here and click edit. And it'll say you're editing a template, which means any changes you make here is just changing what that baseline is going to be when you create from that template. And so I could come in here and we can kind of see what the template looks like with some of this, which when I walk through it, I'm going to go into my example project because it'll be easier when it's populated with some data. But anytime I wanted to make some changes to kind of what this template would have, I'd want to come in here and make those changes, which it's common to want to make changes. I should mention this whole workflow and template isn't heavily used by me at this point. I've used it a little bit. And even in the bit I've used it, as you're using it, there's a lot of things that become evident that, oh, it would be better if this is a little different or if this was a little different. Depending on when you're watching this video, it's possible that the template that I've shared looks different than what you're seeing in this video simply because I've updated it with things that I feel are improvements. But yeah, it's not like this is the battle-tested thing that I've landed on for all time. I imagine it's probably going to change. But let's jump into example project 1 to see kind of what a project looks like using the template that we have defined there. So if I open this as a page, I highly recommend giving a nice cover photo. I mean, I just picked this one kind of randomly. There's some nice, it's linked with Unsplash. I think that's how I found this one. I like searched battle or something. Yeah, look at that. So you can get some nice like HD high quality photos to put in here, and then you can kind of reposition them around. Or you could upload your own photo. But it gives it, some flavor and lets you go in here. And back in the gallery view, it allows it to look better. I would also normally probably change the emoji to something I feel is like thematic for that project. Because that's just fun, right? Then I got a bunch of properties defined here. So when you're seeing properties listed here, these are the columns of your database. So if I was to add a property here, like new prop, and go back to projects, you'll actually see that new prop is like a new column here. So you gotta just understand that, because that might not be what you mean to be doing. Like if I want to do something specific for project 1, but it's not something that applies to every project, I probably don't want to make it a property, because that's gonna add that property for every single project that I have. But we can see some of the properties that I've defined here that I feel make some sense. We have the status and the weight, some of these other ones that were shown there, but then there's some additional ones that are hidden from that other view. One of them is collaborators. So Notion works really well to work with other people. You can invite them to your workspace and share the page and kind of collaborate within it. And actually that was a lot of my use with kind of the previous iteration of this template was in a use case like that, where I was working with one other person. And so this is a place where you could, select another user to mark that they are a collaborator on this project. Board Game Geek link. Maybe your game has been published or actually has a listing on Board Game Geek. You could link that here. This is where I could mark potential publishers. I could select, when I search here, it's going to show me every publisher that's in my publishers table, and allows me to link to as many of them as I want. Like I could add, publisher 1 here if I thought there was multiple that made sense. And then there's our published by relation. So I showed those relations over on the publisher side. By definition, a relation is always going to have a duplicated relation in the other table because they're related to each other. So that's what we got for properties there. But then down here we have the main template. And so I'm just going to kind of go from top to bottom and explain some of my reasoning for why I did things a certain way. But just always keep in the back of your mind that like any of this, I could just like delete this, right, and change it to whatever I want, and then I'll undo for purposes of right now. But it's very flexible. Like you can customize this however you want. However, if you're going to customize it, you want to go into the template and customize it so that way your changes apply to every new project that you create. So one of the things I put at the top of my project template is this player experience goals. And that's simply because the way I like to try to design is trying to have some clear definitions of things I'm shooting for with the player experience. Because ultimately, as game designers, we're designing experiences for people that say, hey, if you follow these rules with these pieces, you're going to have this type of experience. So some examples here, and again, I just made these up for this example, but players shouldn't be sure who is winning until the points are counted up at the very end, or the multi-use cards should allow players to feel like they come up with clever combos. So I have these here, and I have this cool add an experience goal button, which if I click it, adds another one. And so this is another cool just Notion feature, is this template button that I can customize. So I can go to configure to say what it creates when it's clicked. So I've defined that whenever this is clicked, this is what gets created, is this, kind of call out thing with the mountain, and lets me type something. That can be very powerful depending on what you're doing. I mean, I could have a whole template thing in there. An idea I have that I hadn't put in here, but I thought was kind of a cool idea, was maybe if you were going into a playtest and wanted specific questions to ask, you could have the button like throw in the whole preset template of all the questions that you might want to ask, or something like that. But it's just kind of a fun little thing here that you can click and add new, experience goals. And just like anything, any block, that's kind of obnoxious when it's so close to the side there. Any block can just be deleted. Everything is a block that if you hover over like this. But it gives you a nice place to right at the top remind yourself of some of the goals that you have with what you're trying to create here. Next here, we have this table that's showing me my active tasks on the project. Now, what's interesting here, this is something we haven't seen with anything else yet, is this is actually what's called a linked database, meaning it's not a database in and of itself. You can tell because of this little relation arrow, and it says click to navigate to the original database. So there's another database called tasks. You actually can see the link to it down here. A linked database is basically a view into that database, kind of like how we would define views on a database that we can switch between. It's a view that you can embed in another page. And so what that allows me to do is I can filter this on where my tasks are either in to do or in progress and have those be the ones that show up here. So this always is going to be like an active dashboard of whatever tasks I have in to do or in progress. So again, it kind of, as I come into my main page for this project, I can see kind of what's in flight in terms of to-dos with the project. And we'll get a little bit more into what's in the task database. As we scroll down here, we see kind of this nav bar on the left that has a bunch of different resource things and then playtesting pages that we'll walk through all those. And then here I have a database for revisions. And again, this is getting a little bit into just kind of how I have liked to work on some of my projects, where I like to version when I make changes to the game and then I'm going to go to a new playtest that I feel like changes have been made, that it's kind of a different version than the previous one that was play tested. I want to kind of track that as a new version of the game. And so that's what this table is representing, is what each version is. This is, does this version have a physical prototype? Does it have a digital prototype? Because for me, I don't necessarily make a physical prototype for every change. I might be doing some stuff in Tabletop Simulator or elsewhere. Or maybe you don't do digital prototypes very often. Maybe you do mostly physical and only at a certain point do you make a digital prototype. So that kind of is a reminder of what I have for each revision. Release date is essentially kind of the first time it was play tested. That's kind of when I lock in a revision. And then this is kind of a cool column we haven't seen yet, which is the magnifying glass. That's what Notion calls a roll-up, which a roll-up is a auto-computed value based on a relation. So this value here is, I'm not updating this manually. This, as I do playtests and associate them with certain versions, these automatically tick up. And we'll get into a little bit how those roll-ups work more when I get into maybe the playtesting section. But it's definitely a cool feature of kind of some of these useful values that you can aggregate without having to manually calculate them. You set it up and then it'll stay up to date. So I have, like a lot of the other databases, a template for a version. So if we come look at this, and all I really have in this is a little table for the change log. And so what that allows me to do is, if we look in here, I can put in just a list of what things changed in this version. So this was the very first version. And again, this is all dummy data. I made this all up. But maybe this is just like, this is all the initial design with basic mechanisms. It's very possible, and often in my own design flow, I may not be interested in tracking versions until I feel like the game's gotten to a certain stable point. Like the early design process is often very volatile and lots of changes. But maybe I've gotten to a point where I feel like, okay, this is a thing that's testable at this point. I might say, okay, this is now in here with the initial design. But then we can see in this next version, okay, we made the robot player ability less powerful, and we can now perform cleanup simultaneously. And I have some of these possible tags that you could put for the different ones. Pretty arbitrary, but it gives you a nice way to be able to look at specific versions and be like, these are the things that changed in this version versus the previous version. I also can in here see every playtest, which is going to be in my playtest table, that is associated with this version. And that's how we're getting this playtest value, is it's counting up this relation. So maybe I'll just explain this now. If we go to configure rollup, I specify a relation, so related to playtests. Here, because I'm just doing a count, it doesn't really matter which property I select because it's just going to count them. And then it's just going to count all. And so it's just counting how many playtests are currently related to this, and that'll give us our value here. I typically then have this version in dev that's kind of my ongoing, as I'm making changes, I might update this. But once I get to the point where it's like, I'm going to test this in a playtest, then I would probably update the version, kind of lock in the release date, and then create a new version in dev to track like my next version. As far as how I do versioning, and again, this is like a balance between showing the Notion template and showing like my own personal process. So take or leave anything I'm saying with how I do some of these things. But how I do the versioning typically is the middle number is kind of the minor version number, whereas the first one's the major. So I probably wouldn't go to a 1.0 version until I feel like the game kind of like got its solidified main version. Maybe it's going into more of a development phase. So anytime there's any big changes in just the normal iteration of working on a game, I would do this middle number. The last number would be like a really small tweak. So in this example, it was like, okay, we like balanced an ability and we kind of slightly tweak this. So maybe I'm like, that's small enough that it's still going to be version 0.1. It's just going to be kind of ticked up the next version of that. Do whatever is useful for you. But it's probably the software engineer in me that wants to do that. So this is my revisions. I think that covers everything there, which, as you already have seen, ties into some of my other tables, specifically my playtests, which we will get to later. Now let's go down each of these here. And I'm just going to emphasize again, this entire template, like everything we see in here and everything that's nested, is defined as a template for my projects. So if I would create a new project, it would start with all of this but blank without any data populated. And I could have, each project will have its own task database of everything with it and have its own revisions and playtest database. Like that's all specific to that project, which then gets condensed to a row in my projects database. Like that's all within here, which I think is pretty cool and just powerful with Notion with how it's organized. Is so much value and structure is then organized within a table here, which is cool. So let's go down the list here. Tasks. If I jump into my task database, and this is the full task database, I have the default view here as a Kanban board. So you can see here are things that are in to-do, in progress, completed. And each of these can have an assignee. If you're working with another person, you might have different things assigned. And once again, Notion's feature that everything's a page, every item in a database is a page of its own, means that I can, so for example, this one, if I pulled this into working on it, brainstorm new player powers, I could do that brainstorming right here in this page. I could make a list and slime ability and, I could do that all here and it would be organized with the task that I was to do that thing. So every piece of work that I'm doing, it gives me a workspace to document anything I want to related to that task. And then I can move these through here. And as I, finish things, that's automatically going to remove it from this view because this view is only showing things that are in to-do and in progress. So this is going to keep kind of a active working set of what I'm working on. So I think those are some of the, because you might be asking, well, why should I use Notion for task management? Does that really make sense to do for the project versus just storing a lot of my other information? And I find it to be useful to do in Notion for a couple of reasons. One is it organizes it. Like my tasks are all with everything else with my project. But some of these other features, such as each task being its own page that I can put things in and being able to kind of have a dashboard view of what tasks I'm working on, I find that to be pretty useful and worth having within my Notion setup. I think that's all there is to say about tasks. Obviously, just like anything else, you could make a template for tasks if you wanted there to be more to the default for a task. I just have blank because usually, if anything, I'm just going to be brainstorming some stuff for that. Onwards. Design sessions. So a common thing that you might be doing while working on a design project is having specific brainstorming sessions or working through a different problem, whether that's just by yourself or it's with another person. And this is a way to kind of track that. So this is another table. This is actually a list view where it's going to show each design session, the date that it happened, and then who participated. So this is one that is just I did something by myself, but you could keep track of which are ones that were just somebody by themselves kind of brainstorming versus collaborating with someone else. And you can see I have a template for new design session that I would click if I wanted to do a new design session. And it just has some basic things I could define an agenda of just a to-do list of what we want here. Notes on what we're talking about. So as the session is going on, we can add a topic and be we're talking about balancing. And I have this template button just throwing in a toggle that has a bulleted list in it. Because I find it useful, we can in the bulleted list talk about all these different things and put that all in here and have nested bulleted lists. But then when it's all said and done, we can toggle that down to just the one topic, which makes it a little easier when I come back to this to kind of jump through what I want to. And so it's just, a quick little shortcut. This isn't doing a whole lot, but it's kind of a nice little thing to just make it easy to use. And then you'll notice I'm using another linked database to my tasks table and showing the ones that are to do and in progress. Now, why am I doing that? Let's actually jump into this example one I did here. And you can always open as a page to view it wider. And actually, this is a good time to mention, you'll notice I did it wider, but it, for the most part, kept it the same width. If you want something to be in full width, that option is up here in the three dots. And so I could change this to full width and it would be big. For something like this, it actually, I feel like this aesthetic works, but there's certain pages I want to be really wide. So this is meant to look like a design session that's already done. So you can see maybe we checked off our agenda. It looks like I used a very similar example, kind of have some of the things we may have talked about. But the reason I put the linked database is because you can create items in that database from this linked view. So if I click new, I can put something in here and be like, balance player powers, that's just like my go-to right now, which isn't what I want. But I could assign this to someone, and you'll notice it automatically made it to do. And the reason it did that is anytime you create something in a filtered view, it's going to auto-assign properties that fit that filter. So because this filter is only showing to do and in progress, it actually defaulted to do instead of defaulting to like idea or being blank. So what's cool about this is it gives me a way that while we're here in the design session, maybe we were talking about something and it's like, or I'm talking to myself. Like a lot of design sessions are just going to be me. But I say, I should really do this thing, or I should really play around with changing that mechanic. I can just come down here and actually just add that as a task without having to leave this page or anything. And now that's in my task database. It'll show up in my dashboard if it's in to do or in progress, so that I have that documented to work on later. And so that's what I have for design sessions. And yeah, obviously you could change that template and do whatever you want, but I would normally give a better name than example design session. Like a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just take all the titles of my topics and kind of put them as a comma separated list, which is partly why this is so wide, because those can be really long names. But it allows me to, at this view, see like, that's the one where I thought about these different things. Another thing worth mentioning is you might want to do a lot of your brainstorming on paper, right? Like you don't want to sit and type it into a document. You want to draw and do it in a notebook. Well, you could do that and very easily afterwards come in here, add a block that's an image block, and just upload a picture of what you did. And that picture would be embedded in this page, and you would still have it documented in a way that you could come back here and view it later. Without it being in your physical notebook. Nothing wrong with physical notebooks, but some of the big advantages of having it digital is like searchability and organization. Because one of the nicest shortcuts in Notion is you can do Command P, and one, it'll show you recent pages and recent searches, but it allows me to search for things. And if I could search for a specific design session and it'll allow me to jump directly to that page. That's something you can't do with a physical notebook, right? You can't search and have it just jump there. So useful to get things documented into here. And this design sessions database is designed or intended to be a place that you could do that. Onwards to theme research. So I have a few things here that are kind of just like, these are things you might want to keep track of with the project. So it's possible that on a project you may want to have links to information related to the theme that you're doing. So maybe you're doing some historical game. My example here is Mesopotamia. So you could just store things here so that or discussion, or you could even link to a design session. So that's another thing that's kind of cool, is if I do you can mention a person, page, or data, or date. And so I could do like example, if I can type design session, and that actually links now directly to my design session. Another nice thing in Notion to be aware of is it's got back arrows, just like a web browser, so I can just jump straight back to here. So maybe I have something related to theme research that I want to, be able to get back to that design session. But really just a place to store that kind of stuff. I like in Notion using their web bookmark. That's what this is. You put that and then paste the thing, because then you get this nice image. It pulls the image and the link and kind of looks more like a Google result or something, which is kind of nice. So that's theme research. I also have market research, which would be like things related to how well would this design work as a product, or what are some similar games that maybe have done well, or any of this kind of stuff, which maybe you're not interested at all, in which case you could come and just delete this out of the template, right? You don't have to have a market research. This is just an example. So here I have Board Game Geek Smash Up. Maybe this game is kind of like Smash Up, and I want to be able to reference back to that page. Next, we have sell sheet. So I don't have anything in here, but it's common that by the time you're going to want to pitch to a publisher that you're going to need to make a sell sheet for the game, which is just kind of like your advertisement to try to catch the eye of a publisher within one sheet, get the idea across very quickly. So you could create that in Notion if you wanted. Notion has ability to export to PDF. In my experience, it's a little wonky sometimes. The PDF doesn't always end up exactly what you saw in Notion. But as I showed earlier, you can make any Notion page public. You could technically make a sell sheet in Notion and send a link to a publisher, and they would be able to view it that way. Or you could just link to it. Maybe you want to do your sell sheet in Google Docs. You could just put a link here to it, so at least you have access to it from this spot. But that's something that you could do here. You could also take advantage of the fact that Notion lets you make templates. You could make a template specifically for sell sheet so that when you come into here in a blank project, it already has kind of a layout for how you like to do your sell sheets. Just ideas. Same thing with Rulebook. You might want to make your rulebook and actually store it in Notion, or maybe you just have a link to a Google Doc here that's actually your master rulebook. One of the cool things to call out here that Notion lets you do is put in this table of contents block, which will make it that when I add headers like setup, it's going to automatically make a table of contents. So maybe I've got like header 2 for player setup, and then I have header 2 for board setup, but then later I have back to heading 1 for gameplay. So up here, we get this auto-generated table of contents that actually, when you click it, is going to jump and highlight that section. So you can actually have kind of a dynamic rulebook in being able to find certain things. So that is one kind of cool thing that you could get out of Notion that you might not out of wherever else you were storing your rulebook. Next up, we've got prototype files. So this is a place that you could store files related to your prototyping, maybe your physical or digital prototyping. Maybe replacing using something like Dropbox or Google Drive to host things. I will mention this is one of the things where to really use this, you might have to consider upgrading to actually like the personal paid version of Notion, which is like $4 a month or something, which is what I do use. So that's part of why I have my workflow this way, because that's what ups you to, I think, what is currently unlimited file storage, whereas the free plan doesn't have that. But this gives me a database where I could upload those files, or I could just put links to external files, because sometimes there's just things that like Google Sheets is better for, or I'm going to store it somewhere else, but I still want to link to it here. And actually, to give because I don't have any data here, to give an example of kind of what this might look like when it's used, I'm going to quick jump over to a project that I worked on that we used this page pretty extensively. Okay, so we're in the prototype files page for a project I worked on called Temple of Xibalba. And this is kind of what it might look like once you've put a bunch of the files in there. So we had a bunch of our different images, and we could kind of define the file type here. But some of the cool things that you get out of this, one, you get a little preview of what it is there, and like we can come in here and download any of these, so we can get to these, and they're all kind of then, backed up in the cloud. And this was particularly useful because I was working with my friend Tyson on this project, and so being able to share files and be able to work together on that, it was very helpful to have this kind of central repository for that. It's also cool because you have these auto-generated columns of last edited and edited by. So if I would go and upload a new image to this, it would automatically update the date to say this is when I updated it, and it would change it to me because I was the one that changed it. Which again was just helpful in collaboration I could come in here and at a quick glance see which ones maybe Tyson had changed recently. And honestly, maybe it would be valuable. I suppose you could have a view where you sorted by most recently edited to make that even more clear. But yeah, we had other things here like print and play files. We had the full zip for what you needed for the print and play, as well as the video file, the image source file. So we have the actual images, but this was actually the program file that we were making some of the images in. So kind of a cool way, this is a lot more organized and appealing to me than maybe having a bunch of folders in Google Drive. And even if those things were completely equal, having it embedded in my whole project space in Notion where everything else is just kind of nice. The example I have here of an external file is my Nandeck spreadsheet. So we were using the program Nandeck to generate the cards, which if you've never heard of Nandeck, I have a tutorial series on how to use Nandeck that you might check out. Maybe I'll remember to link that above. But Google Sheets is just a better fit for actually having the spreadsheet data and exporting the CSV. So this is just a URL that links to that there. But that's an example of prototype files, which again, if you are really to use this as your main way of storing these types of things, you would probably want to consider upgrading to the paid plan of Notion. Alrighty, I hope that enough people stuck around for what I feel like is one of the cooler aspects of the whole template, which is the playtesting functionality, which is in this section here, and it's made up of 4 different tables. I have my playtest table, which actually each row in that represents an individual playtest. I have a players table, which is players within a playtest. So, for example, I might have me as a player, and I might have someone else that consistently tests, so that I can get data around because maybe I might be a lot better at the game because I test it all the time, and maybe I'm not an accurate representation of a few things, maybe the score, maybe how quickly you play. And so by having that defined as linked to a player, I can do things like filter out plays where I was a player to look at statistics, or I could see what my average score is versus someone else's average score. We'll get into that a little bit. Playtest data is kind of what ties those things together. So if you were doing a playtest with 4 players, each player might have a lot of information related to them, such as what player ability did they have, what was their score, what feedback did they have for you. These types of things. So playtest data, each row of that is for 1 player. So if I had a playtest with 4 players, there would be 4 rows in playtest data where each row is that player in that playtest. If that doesn't make sense, it'll become more clear once I actually start going through these a little bit. Roles is where we get into what a lot of games have in variable player powers or different roles that players might have. And allows you to look at certain things what's the average score when players have played with this particular role. So let's start with playtests. They're kind of all interconnected, so hopefully I'll find a kind of logical way to talk through this. But let's start with playtests. If we jump in here, we see a table that's going to show every individual playtest that we've ever done. And I just have a few example ones here. And just like anything else, I have a template for these playtests. Now, some of the base things that I'm tracking here are what date was the playtest. The title, I just kind of increment the playtests up. Here we see a relation to our revision table. So it's telling me specifically what version did I use for this playtest, that's the same relation that's making it so that when I go in here, I can see the playtests that were related to that. And I could click into them from here. Additionally, we have, was it a digital or a physical prototype? Because that's useful to know because maybe when it's played digitally, it's played a lot faster than physically or vice versa. And so being able to filter on, I only want to look at physical playtests versus digital is a useful thing to do. Duration in minutes. which is a good time to point out that at the bottom of rows of columns in a table, you have the option to add a calculate to aggregate that data into something. So in this case, I'm taking the durations and I'm picking an average. So that actually shows me the average play time. Now this is of all playtests, but if I created views to look at specific ones, so for example, maybe I filter to just digital playtests, I could do the same thing and I could see what's the average playtime for digital playtests, which is kind of cool. I have full game, which is a useful thing because a lot of times when you're playtesting with people, you don't necessarily play a whole game, you play parts of it. But later, if I'm trying to look at statistics and figure out kind of where scores are or balancing things, I probably want to be able to look at only games that were played through the full game, so it's kind of representative data. And then these are both roll-ups, which if you remember, roll-ups are auto-computed values based on a relation. So these are automatically updating as long as I fill out the playtest data properly. So player count is just looking at the playtest data and it's just counting how many players are assigned. New players is looking at the playtest data and seeing how many of them have the new property, which we'll see that once we actually go into one of these playtests. This is also cool because we roll up how many new players were in that playtest, but then I sum them down the column, and so this essentially ends up representing how many unique people have played the game, which is kind of a cool thing to know. You get an idea of like how broadly have we tested this game with other people. Let's jump into one of these playtests to get an idea of what it actually looks like. So let's just go to playtest 3 here, and I'll open it fully. So we see all these same properties here. And then this is kind of filled out what is my template for a playtest. So at the top we have a playtest goal, because often it's good to go into a playtest with something specifically in mind that you want to test. So I just made this up. But then here we have a linked database to playtest data. So this is where because like I said, each row in playtest data is a player's performance within that playtest. And so this is actually filtering where the playtest data belongs to this playtest. So it's only showing the ones from this playtest. And so we can see some good information here. And this is stuff that, you would have filled out after the playtest. I'm linking the players if I want to. I wouldn't have to for everyone. Like, for example, if you were playtesting with someone that you're like probably never going to play with again, it probably doesn't make sense to make a player entry in them in the player database just to track it. But if it's people that are playing it really consistently, by linking it, you're able to get some of the their own personal statistics in relation to the game. A link to the roles database. So in this game, apparently we have an alien power, a robot power, and a dragon power. And so I can by assigning those, it's going to give me the power to aggregate data on, what were the scores for specific roles. Was the player new? This is what ultimately is getting rolled up to tell me how many new players were in a playtest. And then this is just an open text field for feedback. And so I could, put any feedback they have here. I suppose you could also go into the page for this and edit it if you want. And so you can see kind of, if I came back to this playtest later, I can see some of this data. And then maybe just space down here for additional notes from me. Now I should mention, I don't think it's wise to try to fill this stuff out like while you're playtesting or like right after it. In general, it's a lot quicker to like jot down in a notebook feedback from people or the scores and everything, and then later go and populate that into Notion. But I do think that extra step of populating it into Notion is worth the trouble because of a lot of the power it gives you in tracking, being able to reference back to it, and being able to aggregate statistics from the playtest data. So suppose we want to make a new playtest. I would come up here. I'm going to do a new playtest. I pick my template. Let's open this. It's kind of waiting to load up the template. I would say this is playtest number 4. Apparently it's going much slower than normal. I don't know why it's doing that, but I should be able to click new playtest here. And maybe I say this is today. I would assign it to a specific revision and fill out all of this. But I wanted to point out, now that I clicked it, I doubled the template because it finally loaded. So let's get rid of this. But I wanted to point out how you would actually fill out this playtest data. So I mentioned earlier, when you add a new row to a linked database that's filtered, it's going to automatically add it with the filter, with the properties that fit that filter. So by adding this here, even though I haven't filled anything out yet, if we go into it, you can see it's been assigned to playtest 4. And that's because the filter is filtered to this playtest. And so it automatically assigns that there. So I can just come and, add these in here and fill out the data, and it's automatically going to assign it to this playtest and have that all exactly how I'm going to want it to be. But then all of that's going to be in my playtest data table, which we'll look at in a second, which allows you to do some cool things. Let's delete this playtest though. So that's how you would actually track playtests. And obviously if you had a lot more playtests, you might start getting some interesting data from it. I could do things like filter. Maybe version 0.2.3 was a really big change. I guess it would probably be 0.4 was a really big change. And really, any statistics before that don't really make sense anymore because it's after that everything was so different. I could filter and specifically filter after a specific date would probably be the easiest way to do it, to be like only look at the data after the date where that change happened, and then I can see things like the averages and some of this data. But let's jump back and quick look at our players one. We just have a couple of built-in roll-ups here of how many times did that player play the game and what is their average score. And so everything here is auto-calculated. Like as you fill playtest data, this is all going to update with what those players' average scores are and how many times they've played it. You could probably do some other interesting things here, and this is where you would also add new players so that you have them available to assign to playtest. Then we have playtest data, which this one is going to end up having a lot of rows, right? Because we have some of these orphaned rows from my example. But it's going to have a row for every player in every playtest. So you can see playtest 1 was just like a solo one, playtest 2 had 2 people, and playtest 3 had 3 people. But by having it in a table like this allows me to get information like what's the average score of everybody's score, right? Because this has all the scores in here. And so that I could do things like filter out playtests where it wasn't finished. So like, for example, this one wasn't a full game, so I could filter that out. But by having this all in one table, I'm able to aggregate some of that data, because that's a very common thing you might want to do is like, what are the average scores, or what's the high score or the low score? And you'd be able to do that here. And any of these relations you could click through and you could get back to, playtest 3 and see the information there. So kind of cool how you can navigate around. Then, similar to players, we have the roles database, which is all roll-ups. So this is, as long as I fill out my playtest data, this is going to get auto-populated. It's going to tell me how many times has this role been played, what's the average score with this role, what's the high score with this role, what's the low score. And so that's pretty cool, right? Like being able to, as long as you do your due diligence of just filling out your playtest data, you just get this for free because I've set it up, right? Like I configured these things. And you can come in here and see like, okay, the robot is consistently a higher average score than the alien. Now, I will say, typically you don't have the volume of playtest data to really like rely on that as a hard truth. Like, oh, the robot is definitively, too strong because its average is higher when you're working with 10 playtests. And not only 10 playtests, but playtests where there likely were changes between the playtests. But it's still a useful tool, right? It gives you a data point that you can say, okay, this is what the data is showing. And I know there's been a lot of changes and there's not the hugest sample size in the world, but maybe this tells me some things that inform things I should try or things that I should look at. Woo! I am killing my voice here. I have no idea how long we've been going, but I think that is most everything in this design template. I probably forgot something. But it's cool, I think. I mean, I've made this. I'm like praising my own work here. But if I had seen this before I found out about Notion, I think for me it would have been like, oh my gosh, I must have this, which is pretty much how I felt about Notion in general. So maybe that's how you feel. Hopefully this looks like something that might be of use to you. But yeah, that template is powerful because I can come in here and go new board game project, snake game. And that is going to get populated. I don't know why it's loading so slow right now. It's probably because I'm running my recording software in the background and other things. I'm guessing when I click this, it's going to double like it did last time. But I can get that whole template. Yep, there we go. Everything set up ready for me to populate it with tasks, for me to populate it with playtests, to populate it with, like, that's all there and baked in, and all the, roll-ups are already defined. I just have to fill it with my project, and I get all of that value out of it, which is really the reason you'd want to, make a template what you want, because then you get to use it and reuse it and get that value and tweak it. Wowza, I'm going to stop talking and go get something to drink. But if you want to play around with this, go to the link that I posted in the description and duplicate the template, and you can have this entire template as you saw it here, or depending on when you're watching this video, I may have made changes. Play around with it, tweak it, do whatever you want with it. I found this to be very useful for myself in kind of like organizing how I want to work on my own projects and combining maybe what used to be in Google Drive and locally on my computer and in Trello and different things into kind of one central area. But I hope you found it useful. If you're still watching, you might as well hit the like button. I don't know why you would have made it this far if you're not liking what you're watching. Consider subscribing to the channel for more content that hopefully helps game designers, and I will see you in the next video.